verse 20, which is the last verse we actually talked about last time, where Jesus says, "For I say to you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven." So you see, he's set up a high standard there. Your righteousness has got to be better than the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees. And so what's going to happen next from 21 to 48 is you're going to have 6 sections that Jesus starts out saying, "You've heard that it was said, but I say to you." You've heard that it was said, but I say to you. 6 times. The scholars call those the antitheses. And the question is, what is Jesus contradicting? Some people think that he's contradicting the Old Testament and he's giving new rules that supersede the Old Testament. I don't think that's the case. I agree with what the ESV Study Bible says here, and I'll just read what I've got in the box down at the lower left-hand side of the page 6. These verses demonstrate that Jesus' interpretation of the Old Testament is the antithesis of faulty interpretations and applications by religious leaders. Or just below that, MacArthur Study Bible says essentially the same thing. It says, Jesus was not altering the terms of the law in any of these passages. Rather, he was correcting what they had heard, the rabbinical understanding of the law. So he's correcting false interpretations of the law or false applications of the law that the rabbis are giving. If you look up at the top of the next page, second box, Sproul says essentially the same thing. He says, every Jew would have understood the formula, "You have heard that it was said." In using this, Jesus was referencing halakha, that's a Jewish word, the oral tradition of the rabbis. And so he's not contradicting the Old Testament. Jesus upholds the Old Testament. He just told us that he upheld the Old Testament and that he fulfilled it. What he's contradicting is what they have been taught about the Old Testament by the Pharisees. And so that's the way I want to approach these. With that in mind, let's take the first one, which is 21 to 26, okay? You have heard that the ancients were told, "You shall not commit murder, and whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court, and whoever says to his brother, 'You good for nothing,' shall be guilty before the Supreme Court. And whoever says, 'You fool,' shall be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell. Therefore, if you are presenting your offering at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your offering there before the altar. Go, first be reconciled to your brother, then come and present your offering. Make friends quickly with your opponent at law while you are with him on the way, so that your opponent may not hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the officer, and you be thrown into prison. Truly I say to you, you will not come out of there until you have paid up the last cent." And so he says, you've heard that it was said, "You shall not commit murder." And that comes straight out of the Old Testament, okay? But notice what the next phrase is. "And whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court." Now what's wrong with that? The Old Testament didn't say if you commit murder, you're liable to the court. If the Old Testament said if you commit murder, you're dead. That's a capital offense, right? See? And so what the Pharisees have done here is they have softened that. And Jesus is going to get back to the more primary understanding of this. Not that you'll be guilty to the court, because the scriptural penalty is death. But rather, he says, I say to you, whoever is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court. Why would he say that? Is that a new law? I don't think it's new. I think what we've got here is the very tangible law, don't murder your brother. But the root of that murder comes from where? Comes from inside of you. Yeah. And Walt Kaiser, it's not in your notes, but Walt Kaiser has said that The Ten Commandments were made very concrete because then you can bring them to court and you can tell whether the person's been murdered or not. It's kind of hard to tell whether they've been hated or not. But behind the physical act of murder is the attitude of hate. And Jesus says, if you hate somebody, you're guilty before the court. He goes on and says, and whoever says to his brother, you good for nothing, or some of the translations just transliterate that, raka. Raka is the word that's in the Greek text, and it doesn't mean anything to us, but good for nothing is good enough. Sproul says that this probably has to say, you stupid head. Okay? Okay?
Sounds like something a child would say.
Yeah, you stupid head. Yeah, okay. Okay. You say, you good for nothing, you should be guilty to go before the Supreme Court. And then he goes on and says, whoever says you fool shall be guilty enough to go into fiery hell. Now, what's the difference between a good for nothing and a fool? Or a stupid head and a fool?
I've always wondered.
You've always wondered.
How
Okay.
do we, like,
Okay, here's what I want to suggest. The first one is an intellectual problem. The second one is a moral or a spiritual problem. In the context of the Bible, a fool might be very intelligent, but he has a spiritual problem, he has a moral problem because he is opposed to God. Okay? The Psalm says, the fool has said in his heart, what? There is no God. Okay? And so labeling somebody as a fool is not only saying that they're stupid, they may not even be stupid, they might be smart, but that they're opposed to God, they're morally wrong. And he says, if you charge somebody with that, you're guilty enough to do what? Go into the fire of hell. Should I say a word about hell? Carson makes the comment that this is, the Greek word here is Gehenna. It comes from a Hebrew word Gehinnom, which is the valley of Hinnom, which historically is a valley to the east side of Jerusalem that used to be a place where all of the pagan worship was done. Surprisingly, maybe not surprisingly, by many of the kings of Israel as throughout their history. And Hezekiah, I believe it is, no, it's Josiah, who abolished the practice and destroyed all of those shrines and made this into a garbage dump. And so that's the word that he uses as a picture to describe the place of judgment where those who call their brother a fool will end up.
what if the person is a fool? I mean, is the issue you can't say it in anger, or you can never state the blatant fact that this
You can never state the blatant fact that he actually is a fool, okay? That's a good point. It's not really addressed here. My personal opinion, yeah, if that person is actually a fool, then you can label him appropriately. The point here is the attitude of putting down your brother when you don't have a cause for it. Look at verses 23 to 25. I think this clears it up. Therefore, if you're presenting your offering at the altar, and there you leave there you remember that your brother has something against you, leave your offering there before the altar and go first be reconciled to your brother, and then come and present your offering. The Moody commentary says the main point of this verse is that the followers of Christ are to seek reconciliation as swiftly as possible when one has harmed another out of anger. Your brother's got something against you. Maybe it was his fault even. Maybe it was your fault. My reading of this, it doesn't seem to distinguish between the two. There's something that's not right between you and your brother. What's your responsibility? Go make it right. But it was his fault. Doesn't matter. Go make it right. It was my fault. I go make it right. Here's what he says. He says, first be reconciled to your brother, then come and present your offering. How would that look for us today? I mean, we don't go to the temple and make sacrifices at the temple. We're in a different era, right? We get up on a Sunday morning maybe, and we get ready and we're dressed and we go to church, and somebody else in the church we're not right with. Or maybe somebody outside the church that we're not right with. I'm going to sing songs. I'm going to listen to preaching. I'm going to bring an offering. I'm going to do all my churchy things. You know what God says? I don't want them. You got something else you got to do first. Am I misreading that? Don't make me do all the talking. I'm the one with the mic, but how does it hit you guys?
This one's on.
Huh?
It should catch sound.
Okay. What do you think about that? He says, your first responsibility is to get right with your. He says, make friends quickly with your opponent at law while you are with him on the way, so that your opponent may not hand you over to the judge to the officer, and you be thrown into prison. Truly, I say to you, you will not come out of there until you have paid up the last cent. What is Jesus teaching here? What's his expectation? It's far more than just don't murder somebody. It's don't even have the attitude of hate towards them, that you would demean them, you would call them names. And if you're aware that there's a problem, what do?
You solve it.
You solve it, yes.
Okay, what if the other person doesn't want to solve the problem? And I'm at church with them,
Yeah.
and I've tried to have a conversation,
Uh-huh.
and they are not interested in solving the problem.
Mhm.
What do I do?
Help me out with the reference, guys. But Paul says, in so much as it has to do with you, be at peace with all men, right? And so you've got the responsibility to do what? To try.
To seek peace.
Yeah, to seek peace. And if the other person is not willing to make peace, it doesn't mean you won't try again later, but you can actually make matters worse if you insist on, you got to make peace with me right now, okay? Sometimes you got to give some people some time, okay? Does that make sense?
Yes.
It's interesting how this verse is so often taken just for the Lord's Supper, and I think it's because of the wrong understanding of an altar, the Lord's Supper in Roman Catholic understanding of an altar. But here,
I think it has to do with our whole worship.
it's about worship, exactly. Yeah, it's not about the Lord's Supper. It's about the worship, and that a bitterness of heart and an unpeaceful mind is something that God is not pleased with.
If I could take it a step further, I don't think it's limited to even Sunday worship. Paul in another place said, what? Don't let the sun go down on your anger. So if you're aware that there's a problem that needs to be dealt with, and this is Thursday, don't kid yourself and think you've got 2 days to deal with it before Sunday. You know, you need to deal with it now, right?
Yeah, because I think God knows our hearts that we tend to delay.
Yeah.
Or even feeding the anger. I think there is this danger on somehow even feel very righteous about feeding your anger.
Yeah.
And if if you feel mistreated or so, there's this dangerous tendency to even nourish that and somehow even hardening your heart towards peace because
It
you're
feels good to
feeding
be
on it.
angry.
Yeah,
Huh?
It's good.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Any more on those verses? Because we've got 5 more to cover tonight. All right, look at verse 27. He says, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye makes you stumble, tear it out and throw it from you. For it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. If your right hand makes you stumble, cut it off and throw it from you. For it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to go into hell." So notice what he's talking about. He says, what did the Pharisees say? You should not commit adultery. But I think the Pharisees probably took a position very similar to what I've heard from Dennis Prager recently. I've got a quote down here about halfway on the right-hand side of page 7. Denny Burke, talking about Dennis Prager's view. Prager is a unconverted Jewish conservative commentator. He came out and said, as far as the Jews are concerned, they're not concerned with the internal life that Jesus talks about. They're just concerned with the physical act. And he says, and so there's nothing necessarily wrong with pornography. If you watch pornography and it helps your sex life with your wife or with your husband, go ahead. That's what Prager says, okay? Notice what Jesus says. He doesn't say that. He says, "You've heard that it was said, if you should not commit adultery." I didn't do it. I just thought about it. I just looked at it. Jesus says, "But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart." I want to correct one misunderstanding of that passage that I've oftentimes heard. It's oftentimes been taught that in the act of looking at somebody to lust for them, you are then committing adultery. That's not what Jesus said. He said, the fact that you're looking with lust means that you've already committed adultery in your heart. Where did the problem start? Not when you looked. The problem started in here. That's why you looked. Does that make sense? And so the problem is where? It's really a heart problem, okay? And so what does he suggest as a solution? He says, if your right eye makes you stumble, tear it out and throw it from you. Again, says, if your right hand makes you stumble, cut it off and throw it from you. Some people in history have actually taken that very literally and have mutilated themselves in various ways, thinking that would stop their sin problem. It didn't stop their sin problem. Because the sin problem's where? It's in the heart. And it's going to have to be fixed where? In the heart. Notice what, top of page 8, left-hand side. MacArthur says, I think that's MacArthur that I'm reading at this point.
It's under
Yes.
tear it out now.
Yeah, this is under just before the tear it out, okay? The last paragraph before the tear it out. MacArthur says, looking at a woman lustfully does not cause a man to commit adultery in his thoughts. He already has committed adultery in his heart. It is not lustful looking that causes the sin in the heart, but the sin in the heart that causes lustful looking. The lustful looking is but the expression of a heart that is already immoral and adulterous. A friend of mine named Jared Moore, I didn't put this in your notes, wrote a little book called The Lust of the Flesh. And the thrust of the book is he's dealing with something that is in our culture now. People who claim they have a homosexual orientation or a same-sex orientation. And there's some people who are trying to say that, oh, it's okay if you have that orientation just as long as you don't act on it. And the whole point of his book is to say it's the thought in the heart that's already sinful, and you've got to deal with the problem in the heart. Now, I don't take that to mean that we shouldn't put blockers on our computers to make sure we don't look at things we're not supposed to look at, or get accountability partners, or you know, purge things from our lives that are causing problems for us. I'm going to quote MacArthur again. He says, obviously getting rid of harmful influence will not change a corrupt heart into a pure heart. Outward acts cannot produce inner benefits, but just as the outward act of adultery reflects a heart that is already adulterous, the outward act of forsaking what is harmful reflects a heart that hungers and thirsts for righteousness. And if your desire is that you'd be set free from these things, then take some actions that demonstrate, I really want to be free. Make sense? Okay, you guys let me talk too much. Time to get some feedback. What are you thinking? Does this?
This doesn't apply to women at all, right? This is a serious question.
Yeah,
I've never heard this preached applied to women.
You know what?
Lust is like looking for the
I mean,
woman.
he says, he's talking about whoever looks at a woman. I guess it applies to lesbians.
Well, okay.
I mean, so this is an honest question.
Okay, let me give you an honest answer. Okay, I'm not a woman, so I have no experiential knowledge of it, but I have read that this is increasing in our culture to where we even have, to where women are having pornographic lifestyles and lusting after men. What's the name of that restaurant that you can go to and the men are all tight pants and the bow tie and no shirts, huh? I forget the name of the restaurant, and if you don't know it, better for you. But the fact that a place like that exists and that women will go there says it is a problem in our culture.
That sounds like a gay bar instead of where women would go.
I think that problem is more prominent with men.
I think, yeah.
And also culturally, men had much more liberty in going after that than women. But I think it is fair to say that in the same way that you should not commit adultery is both for men and women, and Jesus is explaining this command, and he is now saying this is going deeper than just the outward act. It should be fairly applied to women as well, and seeking lustful after another man.
Yeah. Okay. I guess the one other comment that it can be made, okay, and this probably should be applied both ways too, both to men and women, but oftentimes is applied to women, is consider how you dress. Notice Jesus doesn't put the blame on the woman and how she dressed, okay? Okay? He puts the blame where? In the heart, okay? But that doesn't mean that you have to become a temptress. Does that make sense? So, okay, let me read two more verses, and they're treated separately, but closely related. He says, "It was said, whoever sends his wife away, say to let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the reason of unchastity, makes her commit adultery. Whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery." Now, there's a much longer exposition of this in Matthew chapter 19, and I'm tempted to jump there, but we've got some more that I want to cover tonight. So let's stay within this. Whoever sends his wife away, let him give her a certificate of divorce. That's actually in the Old Testament. It comes from Deuteronomy 24. The larger section is 1 through 4. This is a portion of that. And the Jewish rabbis had a great time discussing what that meant. Whoever sends his wife away, let him give her a certificate of divorce. The men were told that they could send away their wives if they found something unseemly in them. And there were two rabbis named Shammai and Hillel. Shammai insisted that finding something unseemly meant that there had to be a sexual aberration, okay? The sexual sin was the only reason for which you could divorce. Hillel said, anything at all that displeases you about your wife, if she burns your toast, she's gone. If you find a prettier woman, she's gone. You know, and he made it wide open, okay? And the funny thing is, if you wanted to get a divorce, you had to go find a rabbi. And so if you were a man and you wanted to get the divorce, you'd find yourself a Hillelite rabbi, and you know, rather than a Shammaiite rabbi who had very strict standards. Okay. I want to suggest that Jesus has stronger standards than even Shammai. What's he say? I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the cause of unchastity, makes her commit adultery. Now, that sounds like if she's committed unchastity, then you can divorce her. I'm reading that in the sense that if she has committed unchastity, you didn't cause her to commit adultery. She's already committed adultery. And God's plan is still that you would stay married. I guess I have to go to Matthew 19 real quick. We can't get stuck there. Okay. Same question, Matthew 19, verse 3. Some Pharisees came to Jesus testing him. Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all? You know, do you agree with Shammai or Hillel? And he answered and said to them, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh? And then what does he say? So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. What's God's plan? One man, one woman, and you don't separate them. But the Pharisees said, so they said to them, why then did Moses command to give her a certificate of divorce and send her away? Which is the same question we had back in Matthew 5. And Jesus says to them, he says, because of your hardness of heart, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives. I want you to stop at that phrase. And the way I've oftentimes heard it interpreted is, yes, I don't want a divorce, but my wife's just got a hard heart and she won't reconcile, and so we're going to end up with a divorce. That's not what Jesus said. He didn't say because of her hardness of heart. He said because of whose hardness of heart? Your hardness of heart. I think Jesus allows for one exception where divorce is allowed. And that divorce is where you have a hard heart. And in proceeding with the divorce, you are testifying, I have a hard heart. That's what he says, isn't it? And then the command in Deuteronomy 24 regulates that and puts some standards on that so that things don't go totally crazy. But God's plan was what? One man, one woman for life. I'm going to leave that there. I know I've just opened a big can of worms. And if we have time at the end and you want to talk about that, I'm happy to talk more.
But you're not opening it for questions, sir?
And come back to this. Yeah, I just want to get back to the main passage here. Except for the reason of chastity, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman is doing what? Committing adultery. I do like what John Stott says. Jesus is even stricter than Shammai.
Where are you?
I'm on the middle of the right side of page 8. The plain meaning of Jesus' words is the divorce followed by remarriage is tantamount to adultery in the eyes of God. Jesus is even stricter than Shammai. As we see from 19:3, Jesus takes his hearers back to the purpose for which God instituted marriage. It was intended to be exclusive and lifelong. That is the ideal. To fail to keep this ideal is to spoil God's plan for a man and woman. It does not mean that failure cannot be forgiven or that a subsequent marriage cannot be happy and fruitful. It simply asserts that such a marriage is adulterous and can never bear testimony to the one man, one woman relationship for good or ill, which marriage was intended by the Creator to be. If you flip over to the other side, page 9, and go down to the last box before it says Matthew 5:33 to 35, here's what R.C. Sproul says. He says, on the one hand, it is my duty to make clear to everyone in my flock what God commands with respect to premarital and extramarital sexual relationships. At the same time, I have to be acutely conscious of people's frailty and the difficulty of the battle for chastity, a battle it seems that more Christians are losing than winning. We must hold to the biblical standard while at the same time administering the mercy of God to fallen people. And what I would say is this, the dangerous thing that you have to do in a church, the hard thing is to hold the high standard and minister to people who have fallen short of that standard and still minister grace to them. And you want to minister grace to them in a way that does not encourage other people to follow their same path, right? And so you want to maintain the standard, and yet you want to minister grace to those who haven't met it. And at that point, I think I'll open things for discussion and see what you guys think. Does that make sense?
That seems very difficult or almost impossible
Yeah, it's very difficult, okay?
to keep the balance. I mean,
Yeah, to keep the balance.
you need a lot of wisdom,
Mm-hmm.
you know.
Mm-hmm. I'll give you one experience that I had, okay? There was a guy in my Sunday school class some years ago. And he'd been through 2 divorces already. And he was getting ready to get married to a woman who had been through a couple of divorces already. And I spoke with him and I said, I can't encourage this. I think you'd be better off to just stay single at this point. And he heard me. And he basically said, I'm going to go ahead and do it. And I had a decision I had to make at that point. And what I decided, rightly or wrongly, I'll just tell you what I decided, that after he married this woman, I still wanted to be able to minister to him. I still wanted to be able to minister to her. That he was still going to be, I hope, in my Sunday school class, and that there'd be somebody. And since, if you will, once the marriage takes place, I'm going to flip a switch, and all of a sudden, instead of being against them getting married, I'm going to be totally for them staying married. And in that case, I decided I would go ahead and attend the wedding. I don't know if that's the right choice or not, but that opened a door for me to maintain a relationship. Still got a good relationship with him at this point.
Who is that? You can't tell. Tell me later.
I'll tell you later, okay? Okay, tell you
We're
later.
on kid, we're on kid.
Huh?
Okay.
Yeah. You know, you know him.
Say it again, last name?
Huh? you know, okay, okay. That's how I've navigated a hard situation, okay? Your thoughts? Anybody?
I mean, I would consider this for the hardness of your heart. I would interpret it generally as for the people. So there's sinful human beings getting married and should demonstrate something of the faithfulness of in the end Christ and his church, or of the faithfulness and the perfect plan of God in bringing man and woman together. So in a sense, to understand, divorce has always to do with sin, and that's what I like about your approach. We need to make that sure. You know what the Pharisees tend to see is like, oh yeah, we have all those extras, and then it's without any sin, without any guilt. We just get divorced and find another one. But to understand, whenever there is divorce, it is because of hardness of heart and because of sinfulness that is destroying what God has put together. And I think that's so important to understand and not somehow relativize that it is a sinful thing when a marriage is breaking up, when something is destroyed that God has brought together. But then, and that's how I interpret these verses also from Paul in 1 Corinthians 7 as well. There's a second step, like now how is God dealing with sin, and especially also with those who are suffering under sin, and also in relationships, and somehow even to control it a little bit. He allowed this how's it called, the notice of divorce.
Yeah, the Deuteronomy 24. Yeah.
The certificate of divorce.
Yeah.
So it's not like, oh yeah, no problem, but somehow to keep it in that it is not going beyond some rules and regulations, because we have to deal with sin.
A common theological position is taken. It's not my position, but would be to say that there are two exceptions. That if there's an adultery, if there's a sexual sin, then you're permitted to go ahead and get a divorce. And the second case would be if you're married to an unbeliever and the unbeliever wants to leave and won't reconcile, then you're permitted to go ahead with the divorce. I'll recognize sometimes people get divorces that don't want divorces. And it only takes, at least in America, it only takes one person who is dead set on getting a divorce, and that divorce is going to happen. Okay? And you can do some legal things and you can slow it down and you can stall, but you can't ultimately stop it, okay? And I know from counseling situations I've been in, when there's been infidelity, I would never counsel a couple that had experienced infidelity to get a divorce. I would counsel them to reconcile. But in all honesty, I have had very little success with that. Those oftentimes end up going to divorce. And we need to still minister grace in those situations. But I would never encourage divorce in those situations. That's my take, okay? The problem is in practice, most churches that have that theology, what they practice is what I would call anything goes. And if a person comes and says, well, I've been through a divorce and now I'm going to get remarried, they don't ask the hard questions of was that a legitimate divorce and do you have legitimate grounds to get remarried. By whatever standards they understand them, they just do it. I want you to understand, Jesus sets a high standard. God's plan is one man, one woman for life. That's his plan. And yes, just as in the previous section, you ever hated anybody? Ever been angry with anybody? Oh yeah. We fail. And we fail, okay? And God still loves us and still ministers grace. Let me read the next section. Again, you've heard that the ancients were told, you shall not make false vows, but shall fulfill your vows to the Lord. But I say to you, make no oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is the footstool of his feet, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Nor shall you make an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black, but let your statement be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything beyond these is of evil. Notice that he quotes a biblical passage. You shall not make false vows, but shall fulfill your vows to the Lord. And then what did Jesus go on? He says, I've got an even better idea. Don't make vows at all. But if you look in the Old Testament, you'll find out that there are vows taken in the Old Testament. Matter of fact, God himself takes vows. Christ himself takes vows, okay? So what is he really after when he says don't make vows? The way the Pharisees were practicing vows is kind of the way I used to do this as a school kid. I don't know if they say this in Lithuania, but in the United States, it came out something like, cross my heart and hope to die, 1,000 needles in my eye, and I'm promising something, and promising, but my fingers are crossed behind my back. And so what? It doesn't count, right?
You do same that you want if your fingers are crossed.
Same.
Uh-huh.
Same here.
Same here? Okay. You same thing? Okay. Notice what these Pharisees were doing. They understood that if you swear by God, that you are obligated. And so what they would do is they would attempt to sound like they were swearing by God, but give themselves a loophole. Listen to what this says. But I say to you, I swear by heaven. That's not the same as swearing by God, is it? Well, I swear by the throne of God. I swear by the earth, or I swear by Jerusalem. And what Jesus say? Heaven is God's throne. The earth is his footstool. Jerusalem is the city of the great king. I swear by my head. You can't make one hair white or black. You've got no control over your head. And his statement is then, so make your statement be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything beyond these is of evil. You ought to mean what you say, and you ought to say what you mean. Now, I want to just deal with one situation. If you're familiar with Mennonite culture, Amish culture in the United States, they will refuse to take an oath in a court of law. They say, we'll quote this passage and say, we're told here, make no oath at all. What do you think about that?
I think they're reading the plain meaning of the words,
Uh-huh.
and before God, he said, don't make any oaths, and they're like, I'll go to jail before I make an oath. I think they're being faithful Christians.
You think they're being faithful Christians? Well, and I can respect what they're trying to do.
They brought themselves in a lot of trouble, but because of a wrong understanding of what is demanded here. Yeah.
It's a weaker brother, Romans 14.
What's that?
It's like a weaker brother passage.
You could treat that as a weaker brother. I'm not going to criticize anybody for holding that. Here's what MacArthur says. He says, what Christ is forbidding here is flippant, profane, careless use of oaths in everyday speech. In that culture, such oaths were often employed for deceptive purposes. I'm trying to convince you that I'm going to do something when in fact I'm not going to do it. And so he at least does not think this is a universal understanding, a condemnation of oaths in all circumstances, that it's wrong to take one in a court of law or in those situations. I agree with you, Miriam. I think that those who take that position, I can respect that position, and I could support them in that, okay? I don't
And
think...
they've changed the law.
Huh?
And they've changed the law. You don't have to swear an oath if you have a religious objection against oaths.
Okay.
You just affirm that you're going to tell the truth.
I will tell the
That's really splitting hairs.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I affirm that I will tell the truth, and it's not an oath. But they've changed the law.
Okay.
Holding their ground. So.
Well, and that's the point that Jesus is getting at, is that we ought to be what? Truthful people.
And it has a cultural implication. There are cultures that are so used to betraying or being deceptive, even being proud of being deceptive, and that they need all those emphases when they are speaking the truth, or convincing others. But somehow that among Christians a yes should be a yes and a no should be a no is like you should people should expect whatever you say is meant and trustworthy and not only when you somehow emphasize it with some vows or something. Yeah.
Okay.
The Second Baptist Confession has a chapter on lawful oaths and vows, so
Okay.
it's permitted. It has to be very defined.
Narrowly defined, huh? Okay. I haven't looked into that. Okay. Look at verse 38. You've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other to him also. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, let him have your coat also. Whoever forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to him who asks of you, and do not turn away from him who wants to borrow from you. Now, there's a tough standard for you, okay? Notice he does quote a passage of Scripture. An eye for an eye comes from Leviticus 21:24, I think. Also, it's in Exodus 21:24. It's also in Leviticus 24:20, okay? So it's a couple of different places. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But what was the intent of that in the Old Testament? The intent of that in the Old Testament was to set a maximum penalty. Somebody pokes out your eye, you can't poke out both their eyes. The most you can do is poke out one eye. Somebody, cuts off your hand, you can cut off one hand, you can't cut off two hands, okay? It set the maximum penalties. And the way the Pharisees were using this is exactly the opposite. They were using this to set the minimum. You did this to me, I'm going to do at least that much to you. And that's what Jesus is opposing here, okay? And he opposes it by getting back to the spirit behind all of this, which, well, look at the examples. Don't resist an evil person. They slap you on the right cheek, what do? You turn the other also. By the way, a slap on the cheek was not really that destructive, it was more insulting. And so the point is, they insult you, take another insult.
I struggled with this for the long, long time, thinking this is the Christian, standard to say someone's attacks you, you're not allowed to defend yourself. Someone steals from you, you're not allowed to even ask for it back. So it's like, and I was paralyzed in a way to say, oh, I'm supposed to be this rug that people just do whatever they want with.
And again, if you want to talk about Mennonite culture, oftentimes that's the way it's read and that's the way it's practiced, okay? And I'm not sure that's even wrong necessarily up to a point. I saw one little video, a man who's running a little shop in Chicago, and this gang of boys kept coming in and stealing stuff from his shop, and he had an opportunity to press charges on them, and he wouldn't press charges. He says, no, they didn't steal anything from them. I gave it to them. And he did that repeatedly, and it got to their consciences, and he ended up basically leading them to Christ by not pressing charges when they were doing him dirty, okay? How long do you do that, okay?
77 times.
Huh?
70 times 7.
70 times 7. Okay.
Not anything beyond that.
Okay. Okay. Let me read you what MacArthur says on this, okay? He says, the law did...
Where are we now?
I'm on page 10, top. Okay? The law did establish a standard as a principle for limiting retribution to which was just. Its design was to ensure that punishment in civil cases fit the crime. It was never meant to sanction acts of personal retaliation. And then skip down through Carson, and there's another box that says MacArthur, and I'm about halfway down that. He says there's two basic purposes. The first was to curtail further crime, and he says the second was to prevent excessive punishment. Okay? Go down to where it says do not resist. Right below that you have the ESV Study Bible. Jesus is not prohibiting the use of force by government, police, or soldiers when combating evil. What's he doing? He's focusing on individual conduct as indicated by the contrast with Matthew 5:38, which shows that he's prohibiting the universal human tendency to seek personal revenge. So I think we're dealing here with personal revenge. Bottom of the right-hand side on page 10, MacArthur says this. He says, we're not required to respond to every foolish request that's made of us. That doesn't mean every time somebody asks us, I could use $100, make it 200, you know, or euros in your case, huh? You know, I think in dollars. I'm sorry. It's okay. But notice what we're doing. We're giving up our rights. Giving up our rights. How far do you go in giving up your rights?
As far as you want, as long as you're going in the right direction.
As far as you want, as long as you're going in the right direction, okay?
I like that.
Just unpack some of these things. You know, if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, you let him have your coat also. The Old Testament, you couldn't take a person's coat because that was oftentimes their only covering and they'd sleep in their coat. But Jesus says, go ahead and give it to them. Whoever forces you to go 1 mile, the Roman soldiers had the legal right to force somebody to carry their stuff 1 mile. But you know what happens when you carry it the second mile? You've got somebody who's wondering, why are you voluntarily carrying my stuff a second mile when I could only force you to do 1 mile? And it's on that second mile that you get to tell them why you do such things. We had somebody call us, what was it, 2 weeks ago, Miriam? Family we've been ministering to. Mom with 2 kids, about to be kicked out of their apartment. She doesn't have any food for the kids. She called Miriam. Miriam was busy with something else. She called me and said, would you go?
I asked mine. She didn't call you. I talked to you.
Yeah. Miriam asked me, would you go to the grocery store and pick up some food and take it by? We're not going to let those kids go hungry. When I get there, I find out that she's not there because she's going with somebody else who's going out to get her gas money. And I can't escape the feeling that this lady knows how to work the system. She knows who she can call and how many times she can call, and she'll get a little bit here and a little bit here and a little bit here. And I just had to make the decision. I said, look, that's not my business. I spent $70 on groceries. I said, God, I just gave you $70. Do with it whatever you want to do with it. Hope those kids eat, you know. Now, there's obvious limits on that. You can only give what you have, okay?
Yeah. That's what I also think sometimes when people, are begging for money, like by the grocery store, and sometimes they ask you personally, and then usually, I don't know, I don't give money, but when they ask you there, sometimes you're I know if there's a special person or something, you give, and then you 99% you're sure that they just gonna buy alcohol,
yeah.
Or something. But then I'm also having have this thought that it's not my issue. It's on their heart right now, It's their issue right now. They begging and.
Yeah, I knew a guy who worked in New York City. New York City is full of panhandlers, and always asking for handouts. What he had done is he had printed up.
Panhandler. They're holding a pan by the hand and they want you to put money in it. That's an old, but they're not doing that now. But they're still called panhandlers.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Beggars.
Beggars, okay, full of beggars, okay. Always asking for something. What he did is he had a bunch of business-sized cards printed up, which had the address of a rescue mission that he financially supported. And anybody who would approach him, he'd hand them the card and says, you go here.
They'll give you a meal.
And they'll give you a meal. They'll take care of you.
That's good.
And he knew that if they took that and if they showed up at the rescue mission, they'd not only get a meal, they'd also get the gospel and they wouldn't be spending it on alcohol or drugs or anything else, okay? And so that was the way he did it. My daughter, Grace, spent 19 months in Bulgaria, and she was accosted with beggars frequently. She'd been counseled by the people she was working with. She says, you can't give them anything because they're all being run by the mafia. They're all being basically pimped out to beg, okay? And whatever you give them, they don't even get to keep. They're going to give it to somebody else. And you can't supplant this by, instead of giving them money, giving them an apple or buying them some food, they'll get punished for taking that instead of taking money. And so you're not helping matters to do that. So all of that is to say this: we need to be wise in the way we do this, but what's our heart attitude need to be?
Do you think there is a connection to vengeance or retaliation?
Yeah.
So
In what way?
now the question is it just is Jesus coming from not just take vengeance upon ourselves to a much broader case, like whoever asked you for something, just give him freely? Or is there a connection? Because afterwards it also goes like loving your enemies. So in a sense, we have those in I think Second Thessalonians where Paul is saying, well, who doesn't want to work, he should even eat, you know. And he's not saying to the church, there are some people living unorderly and not working because they think they're very spiritual. He's not saying, well, nevertheless, somehow give them the money so that they can survive, but he gives it in other directions. The question is also this somehow to understand, and there is someone who mistreated you, and you feel like you have the right to say, well, you deserve it. And now he's asking you, oh, I need your help. To not somehow close your hand in anger and say, well, this is what you deserve, so I take my vengeance, not actively, but passively.
Passively by not helping you.
Helping. So if this might be in the context like a bit more narrow understanding of this verse.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
That's a good point. The other thing that you said, I'd like to comment on. I think where we sometimes go wrong with this, especially in the matter of giving, it's a whole lot easier to just give somebody a few dollars and go away. Okay? Where what we really need to do is to get more actively and more fully involved in the person's life to truly meet their need. And they're seeking financial handout. They may need some help learning how to manage their money. They may need some help trying to find a job. You may need to meet the real need instead of what they think is the need. Does that make any sense? And don't take the shortcut and hope they'll go away, but take the time to actually care and to get involved. I got one more section. Let me go through one more section. Verse 43. You've heard that it says, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. This comment right there, notice, in my Bible at least, the words you shall love your neighbor are in all caps, which says that's an Old Testament quotation, and it is. And the words and hate your enemy are not in all caps, and that's because Those don't come from the Old Testament. The Old Testament didn't say hate your enemy. But that's the way the Pharisees were treating. Love your neighbor, but hate your enemy. Jesus says, but I say to you, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on righteous and the unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? If you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? And then notice the last verse. Therefore you are to be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. I started in verse 20. Your righteousness needs to surpass that of the scribes and the Pharisees. We've moved from surpassing the scribes and the Pharisees to what? Huh? Perfect. As your heavenly Father is perfect. And I can understand why Martin Luther treated the Sermon on the Mount as if it was law, an impossible to keep law that drives unredeemed sinners to the cross. I think there's some truth in that. But I also think there's some truth in the realization that Jesus actually expects his followers, those who do know Christ, to live this way. And so we're not just supposed to love our neighbors and hate everybody else. By the way, I would encourage you to go back to Leviticus 19 and see how Leviticus 19 defines a neighbor. It includes the sojourner, it includes the cripples, it includes the blind, it includes the deaf, it includes the needy, it includes the poor. It basically includes anybody that you're close to. So when the Pharisee came and asked Jesus, who is my neighbor, trying to find what wiggle room he had for who he had to love, Jesus in essence said, you need to love everybody that comes across your path. And in this case, even your enemies, what do? You pray for them.
And it does show that the love is not meant as a sentiment or an emotion, but an attitude towards someone, and also somehow a willingness to do good to someone.
I like what you say that, willingness to do good. Notice R.C. Sproul's comment, page 11, about halfway down. Jesus was not speaking of warm, fuzzy feelings of affection. Love here is a verb. Therefore, Jesus is not advocating feelings of love toward our enemies, but doing the loving thing. We're to deal with our enemies by doing the loving thing for them. Jesus does not leave that in the abstract. He gives a list of examples to illustrate his point. Bill Bright taught a series of messages called Transferable Concepts. One of them that he taught was how to love by faith. And one of his favorite verses that he keeps coming back to is in 1 John 5, where it says, we know that if we ask anything according to God's will, he hears us. And if we know that he hears us in whatever we ask, we know that we have the requests which we've asked from him. And so then he comes to this passage and says, you're supposed to love your enemies. I don't love my enemies. They've done all kinds of things against me. I don't like them. But Jesus commands me to love my enemies. Is it God's will for me to love my enemies? Yes. So what would happen if I were to pray and ask Jesus, would you help me to love my enemies? Well, first, he would hear it. Secondly, he would answer it. And if I believe that God has answered my prayer, what's the next thing I should do? I don't feel any different. Act different. Do the loving thing. Do the loving thing. And if you do the loving thing, here's what I found. that your emotions will catch up to your actions. And I'll tell you this one story. It's my personal story. Before I was married, I was dating a girl named Karen. One of my best friends was also spending time with Karen. I scored the coup. I got her for Valentine's Day, took her out to dinner. 2 weeks later, he proposed and she said yes. All of a sudden, there's this tension in our relationships. And it wasn't made better because we all three worked in the same office. And so we saw each other every day. And it was difficult. And it wasn't made any better because we were all working for a Christian organization. We all did financial support raising to be involved in ministry. And here we were kind of at each other's throats. So here's what I did. I got together with Kurt and Karen. And I became a financial supporter of their ministry. Jesus said another place, where your money is, there will your heart be also. And I started supporting them on just a small amount.
$5 a month.
I think it was 20, but it's 20 now. We're big givers, but it was enough to where I routinely got their prayer newsletter and was praying for them. And you know how hard it is to continue to feel animosity for somebody when you're giving to them financially and you're praying for them and for their ministry? It's hard. But that was just a tangible way when I was putting in practice here. Love somebody that I'm having a hard time with. I wouldn't have called them, even then, I wouldn't have called them my enemies, but it was a difficult thing.
There were friends that were hard at that time.
To love.
Friendly too.
Yeah.
Hurt. But see, it's all good because then I came along.
She came along. And
The greater blessing.
And Kurt and Karen went and spent 20 plus years in Budapest as missionaries, and they're back in the States. And I just recently spent a day with Kurt. He is in late stage cancer treatments right now, and we had a lovely day together. Okay, and he's to this day one of my best friends. Okay. But I had to take an action at that point to do the loving thing. Okay, any comments? Am I making any sense at all? Some, okay. And notice, just one more time, and I'll close with this. We've moved now from your righteousness needs to exceed the righteousness of the Pharisees to do what? You need to be perfect like your Heavenly Father is perfect. I can't meet that standard. You can't meet that standard. But Jesus met that standard, and He can live His life through us, and we can grow in sanctification towards that ideal, which will finally be reached when we go to be with Him.
Isn't there even like a blessing or a promise in the very phrase, your Heavenly Father?
Your Heavenly Father, yeah.
So it's not you must meet the standard of God, the judge, but your Heavenly Father. So there is a relationship and something we grow into similarity because we are adopted children, and He is changing us as a father. Yeah.
Okay. I haven't really been watching my time that close, but I think that's probably a good place to stop. I'll be back on Tuesday. We'll get one more session, and we'll see how much of chapter 6 we can tackle.